Hello everyone and welcome to your first Flip Collaborate for Teaching Literacy 2020. My name is Rachel Couchy. For those of you who don't know me, I have been at Soul for about 6 years now, and I think I've been through 17 teaching periods. I counted them up the other day. I think it's about 10 times that I've been in this unit. So quite a number, and this last incarnation of this unit is where we introduced this cafe style learning. So if you haven't had a look at the assessment details yet, you may not have realized that you actually have a choice of 6 assessments rather than just the usual 3. So you have 2 choices at every stage of assessment 1, assessment 2, and assessment 3. You've always got 2 choices. Some people were a little overwhelmed by that at first. They just like to be told, you know, these are the assignments and this is what I've got to do. But just with the 2, it's not hard to make a choice, and there are some tips and tricks with that in our Padlet as well to make it easier for you to decide. So there's going to be a flipped collab on both. This one is for designing your own unit, and the other one is evaluating a unit. So it's a unit, a grade 4 unit called 1788, was life the same for everyone. And that's a unit that's come, I'm not sure who developed it, but it's a unit that you can find on the internet. It's a ready-made unit where you evaluate what you think of it and tell us about the pedagogical strategies and assessments and other things that they've used within the unit. So great choices. Today we're going to talk about designing a unit, and I guess at this really early stage of the unit you want to be thinking about what exactly you need to know at this particular stage. So it's week 1. We don't want to overwhelm you, but we do want to give you some information just to help get your head around what the assignments are. And then also, if you do manage to choose one, maybe a few things that can just help get you started or where you need to start. So I haven't actually included any information about dates and times and due dates and all of those things because I know that you can look them up yourself. My little slide doesn't want to change. There we go. So, welcome to the Flipped Collab. This is Rachel's top 5 things that you need to know to get started on this assignment. Now, our first point is point 1, connect the Australian curriculum. Now, I don't know whether I should be admitting this on here or not, but I am not a huge fan of the layout of the template. And I'll tell you why. And I have complained about it the last couple of TPs, but unfortunately it's still the same. We just have to think about how, or perhaps where we start, I suppose, is what I'm getting at. So if you have a look at the template, the way it's set out, it's actually set out where your lessons are the first thing that appears in the unit template. So it says the title of the unit, the year level, and the class. And then it mentions the duration of the unit, which is 6 weeks, which is where your lessons go. And then under that, you've got your curriculum links and things like the unit rationale, unit objectives, all of that sort of comes underneath. And with that, what my risk is that people are thinking about the lessons first and developing their lessons and then trying to connect to the Australian curriculum afterwards. So please don't do that. It's really a recipe for disaster because it is so much harder to have ideas about lessons and to have ideas about perhaps teaching content, saying to yourself, oh, I really want to do a unit where the kids learn to write a narrative, and then going back to the curriculum and trying to make things fit. So please, if you were in a school, when you guys get out after you finished your degree, this is the way you will plan. So you'll sit down with the curriculum and then you'll look at the content descriptors for a particular age level, for a particular year level, and you will pull out certain descriptors that you want to focus on, not the other way around where we think of teaching practices and ideas related to a particular book or a particular comic. You know, we can sit there and say, oh, I really like Ando's little refugee, I want to write a unit about it. But what's the focus? What are the kids getting out of it? How are we going to make this fit within the curriculum? Because everything comes back to curriculum outcomes, because that's what we're reporting against to parents, and that's what we are measuring all our assessment against. So please start off thinking about your content descriptors first. So scroll down that template and get down to the curriculum links, the content descriptors and codes, and think about what kind of content descriptors you're going to choose. Now, my other word of warning, the benefit of doing this unit so many times, is be very specific about the kinds of content descriptors you choose and whether that's the actual focus of your unit or not. You don't want to have content descriptors in there that are not being taught within your unit. And I know that was many times when I was marking unit designs last time where I'd say this content, you know, put a little circle around it and say this content descriptor wasn't taught in your unit, this content descriptor wasn't taught in your unit. And I can understand where perhaps some students went wrong, because there might have been a focus of the unit that, say, was about writing a narrative, but they decided to sort of squash in a unit, a content descriptor that was about talking and collaborating with each other, and they thought to themselves, oh, my unit's got a bit of collaborating, I'm going to chuck that one about discussing ideas in there as well. But it wasn't really relevant, because if you don't have a speaking and listening focus in your unit, unless the kids are specifically being taught those skills, then we don't want to add in things that are not being taught. So think really specifically about what the focus of the unit is. I would rather you had less content descriptors and made them fit within the lessons better than having 5 or 6 and for me to circle that one's not relevant, that one's not relevant. I'd rather have 1 or 2 and have a really explicit focus. If you know that all of your lessons focus on paragraphing, have 1 great content descriptor about paragraphing, rather than 3 or 4 about things that are not relevant to the unit. So be really, really explicit. So for example, we've got some examining literature. Could be, I've just pulled these out of the Australian curriculum. I'm assuming everyone is going to get very well acquainted with the Australian curriculum. You should already know a little bit about from Australian curriculum from other units, and you've just come from developing literacy, which has also asked you to use the Australian curriculum and look at those 3 strands that we're having a look this week, week 1, looking at literature, looking at literacy, and looking at language. So choose a specific focus. So it might be something like, discuss how language is used to describe the setting in texts. So that's a reading outcome where kids are thinking about particular settings. Could also be linked to writing in terms of how they're going to talk about a setting in a text. But the best thing to do within the Australian curriculum is click on the elaborations. The elaborations give you so much more detail. So if you were having a look at this and thinking, I don't really know whether they're talking about the setting in terms of when they read a story or the setting when they're going to write their own story. So let's click on the elaboration and see. Discuss the nature and effects of some language devices used to enhance meaning and shape the reader's reaction. So if I was going to I could do a whole unit on language devices, and that would be my content descriptor. We've got some things, say, for example, we've got language for interaction. You could have things like looking at technical vocab. So a vocab unit could be developed where they do a series of lessons and they look at particular ways to extend their vocab and perhaps looking at unknown words. So that could be your particular unit. You might be wondering what needs to go in these particular 6 lessons. And you won't even get a chance to write your 6 lessons yet, so I wouldn't even be worrying about that until we get to the interactive collab where we can break it down and give you a bit more information. So what's my top thing to know about the Australian curriculum? Do it first. Do it before you get any other ideas. Do it before you choose a book. There are lots of great resources out there, like you might say, oh, I really love this video, I want to include it. I really love this big book, I want to include it. But remember to start with your curriculum. Don't try to make it fit just because you like the book. It's not going to work. So start with the curriculum. Less is more with your content descriptors. So we would rather have you had 1 or 2 really great content descriptors that matched your unit really well, and you taught those particular content descriptors really well, rather than some vague ones that didn't connect back. I mean, we wouldn't want to have a whole lot of writing content descriptors, and your whole unit is based around writing a narrative. We shouldn't see a content descriptor in there that's about spelling, because you didn't teach any spelling in your unit. The kids might have been spelling incidentally, but it wasn't taught, so we can't tick it off as a content descriptor that's been taught. Okay, then you can have fun and choose your content and your resources. So this is the fun part. So if I know that I'm going to teach a whole unit about what did we say, language devices perhaps, then you can go looking for something that lends itself well to that. If you're going to be looking at vocab, you can choose books that have some really great vocab in there that you can break down. You might even look at different words in terms of their morphology or their background. So you look for stuff that can then fit in around your content descriptors. There could be any sort of, like a mentor text or a rich text that you're going to use to talk about your ideas. If your focus is on visualizing, you're going to have some of those great texts and those great videos or templates or whatever it is that you're going to use to enhance your learning in your unit. But focus on your curriculum links first. You might also know, which I didn't mention when I was talking about curriculum, that there's also some cross-curriculum links in the template. Don't worry too much about them. We can explain more about that in their interactive collab. I'm just giving you my 5 things to get started, but we can relate to other subject areas as well. But you don't want that to take over. And you've got to remember that this is a literacy unit, and we don't want to be get lost in and then it accidentally turns into a science unit where the other curriculum links have sort of dominated. We have to keep our literacy hat on at all times. So then you can have fun and choose all your content that's going to go into your 6 lessons. Now, when we say 6 lessons, we don't mean 6 lesson plans, like a huge long lesson plan that you would do with your prac. It's just a short overview of what would be taught. And if you come to the interactive collab, we will help you with what needs to go in that section. All right, my number 3 thing that you need to understand to be able to start this assessment is to understand pedagogy and multiliteracies, because you will notice that sort of a little way down the page, the first page, the bottom box says teaching strategies. List the pedagogical practices that you will use throughout this unit. We're going to talk a little bit about pedagogy. You've probably got a bit of a basis from developing literacy already about what pedagogy is. So you talked a lot in developing literacy, and I know because I just came from there myself, that we talk a lot about pedagogy being the how. So if you think about the curriculum being the what you need to teach, which is why I told you to start off there, the pedagogy is the how. How are you going to teach the what? How are you going to teach imagery? How are you going to teach visualizing? How are you going to teach paragraphing? How are you going to do that? So you need to think about what your pedagogical strategies are. Now, I've got my little list here, and you will notice that some of the pedagogical strategies are very literacy specific. So things like things like shared reading or guided reading or interactive writing or language experience. They're all the kinds of things that you already know from developing literacy, literacy strategies. And that wonderful literacy toolkit, I've just given you the link down here because I love it so much. And if you haven't used it yet from Developing Lit, then you definitely should. because it breaks down in really clear language all of those strategies that are used in the classroom. So it's a great, great resource. So if you need to look them up again, you've forgotten what modeled reading is, go back and have a look at that teaching, what's called toolbox, literacy toolbox. It's got all of the strategies in there. So throughout your unit, obviously you're going to be using some of these literacy strategies. So you might have a point in there where you're going to be modeling something. You know what, some students even last time put it in bold in their lesson plan so that we didn't miss it. And I thought, oh, that's great. I can see exactly where they've got their modeling and their shared experience and their conferencing and their group guided reading group here. So we can see how you use these strategies. So you've got to use some literacy strategies because it's a literacy unit and we'd expect to see some form of modeling or guided help or some sort of independent reading at some stage, depending on the grade level, which I will also talk about in a sec. So have some approaches that lend themselves to literacy, but you'll also notice in there that I've included things like or gradual release model as a whole, but things like collaborating, visual thinking strategies, just grouping, flexible grouping. So you don't have to have things that are just related to literacy. Collaboration can be used anywhere, but it is a strategy for helping kids to learn. It's a how. So even if you just say that these particular students are going to be collaborating and doing some group work, that could be highlighted as a teaching approach. You've got some people using some sort of mind map or some sort of graphic organizer to align their thinking. Perhaps this is for some sort of tuning in or shared approach or a think, pair, share, or any of these strategies could also be highlighted as a pedagogical approach. Obviously, the literacy ones are going to be the big ones, but there could also be some collaboration or some sort of visual thinking or other things. Does it need to have the other things? No. How many does it need to have? Well, how are you going to make it fit, I think, is a better question. There's not to say that you have to have 5 pedagogical strategies. Just think about it more as within your 6 lessons, what works. And you'll find that you use them anyway, because it's just natural that if you're writing 6 lessons, you're going to use some of these things. Now, also embedded throughout the unit, so you're going to be showing us at multiple points during your 6 lessons, is how you're using multiliteracies. So what do we mean by multiliteracies? You might not know too much about it yet because there's more coming up in the unit, but if you think it's something that you're going to be really stuck on, then maybe just click ahead. I can't remember if it's week 5 or week 6, but there's a week where we have a look at the chapter. It's chapter 5 in the McLaughlin text that talks all about multiliteracies, and I think it's really clear where he talks about all the semiotic systems and how you can use them in the classroom. Don't just focus on ICT. I'm sure that you guys know that. So we're thinking about things that can enhance the lesson. So throughout your 6 weeks of lessons, we would expect to see that information is presented in a different way to make it interesting, but also to give the kids that sort of, exposure to different ways of learning. Because, for example, if I want to teach inference, I can grab a text and I can show kids how to look for clues within that text, but then I might also grab a YouTube video and ask them to infer from the visual media. Or I might grab them a podcast story to listen to, or I might have them do some role play. I don't know, but I'm giving them opportunities to learn the same content. So you think about Hattie and you think about those high impact learning strategies and you think about multiple exposures to the same content. Well, you can use lots of different multiliteracies to present information in different ways to keep it interesting. So we should see some element of visual, gestural, audio, spatial. Do you need to use them all? No. Do you have to use particular ones? No. But we should see elements of it within your lessons. Number 4 is assessment. If you go right down to the bottom of your template, not right down because the unit plan evaluation, but you've got assessment strategies. So what assessment are we going to use? Now, if you flick back just to the previous page, you'll already see that you've covered student background knowledge. So I'm just going to talk about that really quickly because that's a little bit before the assessment. So we're talking about what the kids already know. So basically, I think the easiest thing to do for this is to have a look at the previous year level and take some ideas from there. What I mean by that is, if your unit is going to be a grade 4 unit, your background knowledge, you could assume, because this is just a made-up class, we don't have any, exact scenario or exact, situation to go off, is for a grade 4 level, we can assume that the background knowledge that the kids have is that they've achieved the grade 3 unit descriptors. So if you're writing narratives and you're writing it for grade 4s, what have they already done in grade 3 to give you that background knowledge? Now, we know not everyone's at the same level, but again, it's just sort of a general overview of pretty much where the kids are starting from. Now, just 1 second talking about year level. Now, all of the assessment details and all of the sort of things in the unit tell you to use grades 3 to 6. You can actually use grades 2 to 6 because we're just making the exception just to help out those who are following more of an early childhood stream. So if you're a little bit stressed about the fact that this is pretty much middle to upper school within this teaching literacy subject, which it mainly is, but we've allowed you to use grade 2 if you would wish, so that's fine. Now back to assessment. If you are thinking about an assessment, again, we're picturing ourselves in the classroom and what we are going to do when this is our real life. So you're going to sit, before you can do anything in your unit, you need to have some before strategies set in place. So what are you going to do in that first lesson to set yourself up to get some information from the kids? It could be something formal, like you want to do some sort of little written pre-test with them. It could be something as informal as you ask them a question and you get them to hold up a whiteboard and show you their answer, or you get them to turn and talk, or you get them to write 5 things that they know about the subject already. But they should have some sort of, because imagine this was really you in the classroom. You need to know where the kids are at. How are you going to teach them 6 weeks of narrative when 10 kids can already write narratives beautifully and 1 kid's got no idea even what the word narrative means? So you need this information. So what are you going to do? What assessments have been put in place prior to starting the unit? How do you know where the kids are at with their learning? And obviously we've connected to the student background, so that will give you a bit of a hint as to where they're coming from. So in your first lesson, we should see some sort of assessment being applied. And you're also going to list it in your assessment strategies in that paragraph. Now, please don't just tell us, I'm going to use formative assessment, because formative assessment is a huge umbrella of assessment. It's just a name which forms together all sorts of formative assessment, which is as and I was going to say for learning, but not mix myself up. So summative assessment is more the testing, diagnostic test, more formal assessment, whereas the formative is more things like those. I've got in my middle thing here, formative assessments like mini whiteboards, conferencing, traffic lights, perhaps things like rubrics, or, some sort of template to fill in. So we've got things that are going to happen. So don't use just umbrella terms. Don't say to me that we're going to use formative assessment and then we're going to use some summative assessment. It's far too broad. Tell us exactly what you're going to be doing. We want some things to happen before to set you up so that you know where the kids are coming from with the unit. We want some things that happen during, and when we look at your 6-week lesson plan, we should see a point of contact with assessment during the unit, and perhaps something just to wrap it up at the end. What assessment will be carried out at the end of the unit to gauge the understanding. The assessment should be assessing the learning intentions and the rationale. So you're connecting back to the curriculum, you're connecting back to whatever the rationale and unit objectives were. Think of those, if I was rewriting this template, I would call them the learning intentions rather than learning objectives. But so basically they're going to be, say for example, your unit design was based on getting the kids to write a paragraph, an effective paragraph. So that's what your unit rationale was, to get them to learn that in the 6 weeks. So now we need to know, did they learn it? Was it effective? We've had a point of assessment at the start. We've had some things going on during the unit because we don't want to get to the end of the 6 weeks and find that the kids don't know anything. And then something at the end to wrap up how the unit all went. It might be a good idea to have a mix of formative or summative assessment, but there's no hard and fast rule about that. You could have all formative assessment if you wanted. So that is assessment. We're going to talk more about that. Again, this is just the collab to get you started. We'll be talking more about all of these things in the interactive collab. Something that you also need to do, which is my point number 4, is be inclusive of diverse learners. So again, what I love about this is that you're picturing yourself in the classroom. It's all very real life. Like I said with the assessment, you're sitting there in your chair thinking about what the kids need to know. Something else that you need to do is, in this imaginary unit planning, is to be inclusive of all learners. So we know that some are going to be high flyers and they could be a year or 2 years ahead. We know that there's going to be, because even though we don't have a particular scenario, this is the case in any classroom. Open up any classroom in Australia and we're going to know that in a class of 25 to 30 kids, there's going to be kids above, there's going to be kids below, there's going to be kids with certain different cultural backgrounds and certain needs. So we need to show within our planning that we can cater to students with diverse needs. So we need to be showing that just throughout our 6 lessons. Just making sure we don't need to write it anywhere else, but no, we don't. So just in our 6 lessons, we're just showing that we're differentiating what we're doing. So if my lesson number 1 has all of the kids are going to sit down and write a paragraph for me, and then all the kids are going to go back to their table and write a narrative on their own, then they're going to submit to me what they've done. We can see already the problems with this lesson is that everybody's doing the same thing. Nothing has been changed in terms of perhaps the challenge or the difficultness. I don't even know, that doesn't sound like a word, but you know what I mean. We want to challenge those more capable students. So perhaps you need to look, if you've got a grade 2 unit and it's about writing narratives, if you know that there's going to be kids who can achieve to a grade 3 or 4 standard, maybe look at the content descriptors for grade 3 and grade 4 and see where those ones are going to need to be pushed to. How can you cater for that? Perhaps you need to be arranging content differently. So perhaps for a particular groups, a high flying group, you might say that they are going to be working on some different content to groups B and C. They're going to be doing something different. Perhaps different teaching approaches would suit them better. So you might have a group of struggling students that are going to come to you and do an explicit modelling session with you. You might acknowledge that, kids in group A don't need that. They're going to be doing a guided session with you at a different time, doing something different. So we want to see that some thought has gone into how you're catering pedagogically, so how the different pedagogical strategies could change for each sort of different area of the classroom or groups within the classroom, or how the content could be arranged differently. You might even have different assessments. Perhaps you've had to think about the fact that there might be some kids who aren't capable of filling out the rubric on their own. They might need to have some time to sit with you and talk about what they've learnt. So have a think about that as well. My mouse is gone. Now when you differentiate, it's not always about adjusting the work. It can also be, you can also show us how you've been inclusive of all learners by doing things like timing. So you could say within your lesson, you know, there could be a struggling group who's going to get 20 minutes to work on the task instead of 10. So that could be a way of showing us that you've given some thought to what the lowest group might need. You've given some thought to the timing within, you know, the high group might need. Perhaps the lowest group in your 6 lessons, maybe they have the teacher more often, but for a shorter amount of time. Perhaps the high group, because they can have that depth of discussion and really concentrate, perhaps they don't see the teacher at all, but they just see her once, but for a longer period of time. So, you know, think about when the touch points are and how you can adjust to suit the needs of the students there. The grouping flexibility is a terrific way to show us that you've considered the range of learners. And when we say diverse learners, we're just talking about all the different learners in the classroom. So show us, you know, whole class or small groups, or maybe that rubric I was just talking about, maybe that needs to be done in pairs, or you know, maybe a small groups are gathered at certain times within your unit to show that you're catering for those who are struggling, those who are doing okay, and those who are doing more. So think about your grouping. So you could choose different content, so different sheets. Well, I mean, hopefully you're not doing too many worksheets, but different content for different points in your unit, perhaps different teaching approaches, different assessments if need be. Doesn't have to be, but that could be a way of showing us that you've considered diverse learners, different timings and groupings for your learners. Now over here is the template that I don't like the order of. So you can see up here it says duration of the unit is 6 weeks, and that's where your 6 weeks of lessons go. So skip that for now because you're going to go straight to your curriculum links. Over here is what I was talking about earlier, is your cross-curriculum links. So for example, you might want to choose a bit of a science focus. So you might also be covering, say, you might do a unit where the kids read about solids, liquids and gases, but you just need to remember that you're not losing focus of your literacy. We had some students last time where you know, they had a bit of a history or a science focus, which is great because it makes it engaging for the kids, but I think their science and history links sort of took over, and then their English links sort of fell behind, and we have to remember it's a literacy unit, so the literacy's always got to be at the forefront of your mind. We'll talk more about teaching rationale and the objectives in our actual interactive collab, and we will also talk about the unit plan evaluation, which is your 200 words at the end, where you are going to evaluate your own unit and tell us how great it is. Now, also over this side, probably not something that you need to know just yet, but I'll mention it while it's here. If you could please, now I said that there's 2 ways, but I'd actually like you to do it the first way. So I've changed my mind a little bit here, because last time we had to click on every single link when we were marking your assessments, and as much as we love doing that, we much prefer for you to just type it out for us, especially if you've only got 1 or 2. It would be much easier just to type rather than us having to hyperlink to your particular code. So if you could set it out like that top one, that would be fantastic. So in the rubric, there are some important features. It talks about your pedagogical strategies and assessment and how they align with the Australian curriculum. So that's why I said start with the curriculum and then link your pedagogical strategies and your assessments to that. We will help you at the interactive collab, so please come along. Your unit plan clearly explains its purpose and how you're going to support children's literacy development. We will help you write that at the interactive collab too, as well as DB discussion, obviously. You make considerations for your diverse learners, you make sure it aligns with the Australian curriculum, which I've just explained, and your literacy is also good. It's part of the rubric, as it always is. That's the end of our show. I hope this has helped to get you started or helped to get your head around this first assessment. And I'll see you in the DB. Thanks, guys.